Hill Jack is a Victorian-era legend. It begins in London around 1837 with a cluster of strange attacks and sightings. Jack was typically reported as being a tall, thin man with red eyes and superhuman agility, hence the eponymous spring heels. People would also claim that he had iron claws, and perhaps most sensationally, that he could shoot blue fire from his mouth. Jack would typically assault young women, and these stories caught on and were told and retold because they were mysterious and thrilling, but also because they illustrate the very real threat of sexual assault in contemporary London, particularly for young women. There are at least 2 well-recorded accounts of assaults, supposedly perpetrated by the Spring Heel Jack figure, and there was a legitimate police investigation. The police came to the conclusion that Jack must have had an accomplice, which could help explain some of the supposedly supernatural aspects of the assaults. Those investigating these crimes even went as far as attempting to replicate the effect of blue flames appearing to shoot from an individual's mouth. And they actually managed to do this in a laboratory setting by using a sponge impregnated with alcohol or white spirits. Writer and historian Mike Dash, who is an authority on Spring Heel Jack, suggests that they were also contemporaneous magic books which contain similar techniques. In the Victoria era, entertainment in its various forms was nowhere near as ubiquitous and accessible as it is in our time. Dash notes that it was relatively common for young Londoners to put a sheet over their head and run across the heath or the common on a moonlit night. This would have been their idea of a bit of a lark, where they could potentially scare some bystanders. People these days do similarly foolish things. Take, for example, the recent killer clown phenomenon that was prevalent in the United States. Following the Spring Heel Jack furore, there were many fakes, false sightings and copycats which muddy the waters and confuse the initial investigation. Subsequent reports are much less credible. Thus, Jack exists in the shadowy grey area between history and folklore, which is where we all live, really. Like Jack the Ripper, Spring Heel Jack represents a confluence of old world devil tales and more modern fears. With his springs, his iron claws and blue fire, Jack is high tech. He embodies contemporary advances in chemistry and mechanics, which are synonymous with the Industrial Revolution. In Victorian London, the working classes didn't see Jack as a supernatural threat. They saw him as a wayward, rich aristocrat on some sadistic rampage. Mike Dash suggests that this was a common notion at the time, that of the wealthy aristocrat with too much time on their hands. Due to their money and position of power and influence, they could get away with anything. I imagine that this fear stems partly from abuse of servants in aristocratic houses, which must have been relatively commonplace at the time. Indeed, one of the key suspects in the Spring Heel Jack case was Henry Beresford, the 3rd Marquis of Waterford, who was known for carousing and brawling and womanizing. He would have had the money and the time to plan these attacks and buy the necessary equipment, but there is no concrete proof of his guilt. So the police had their suspects, but they didn't have enough evidence or reliable witnesses, and the investigation seems to fizzle out with no one charged or convicted of the attacks. After 1840, coverage of Spring Heel Jack was less prevalent and the story fell out of favour. However, after 1860 there was a marked re-emergence of the tale, possibly due to the proliferation of unstamped newspapers and penny dreadfuls. Stories relating to Spring Heel Jack would prevail on slow news days. If there wasn't a gruesome murder or any parliamentary gossip to report, struggling journalists would come up with sensational stories relating to figures that were compelling and had an established intrigue and public appeal. Thus, the old Spring Heel Jack stories will be brought up again. This kind of sensationalist journalism still exists today. You can see it in clickbait stories with intriguing titles such as "My dead girlfriend keeps messaging me on Facebook," or "You won't believe what these celebrities look like now." Dash asserts that understanding how journalism worked during the Victorian era is key to understanding how the Spring-Heeled Jack story spread and developed over time. By the time Jack was appearing in the Penny Dreadfuls, rather than being portrayed as a villain, he becomes a heroic figure. With all his fancy equipment, he is like a prototypical Batman. In some of the Penny Dreadfuls, he even hides in a cave in a graveyard, so there are strong parallels to Batman. Mike Dash explains that legends like Spring-Heeled Jack pop up in many different times and places. Similar tales crop up in places where Britain had established links, such as Newfoundland, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. Newfoundland had Spring-Heeled Jackson, for example, who again became a more heroic figure. However, these stories also exist in places where there are no obvious links to London. For example, there are similar tales in Somalia, revolutionary Russia, and most notably Czechoslovakia, with Perak, the Spring Man of Prague. It's interesting how these tales appear and migrate, or maybe they are just intrinsic to the human imagination. The majority of the information that I used in this video was gleaned from an episode of the podcast MonsterTalk, which is a skeptical sciencey show about monsters. The episode is entitled Hop Springs Eternal. As you can tell, host Blake Smith insists on using horrendous puns that usually exist these pregnant, awkward pauses, as his academic guests fail to be amused or come up with a response. But overall, Monster Talk is a well-researched, well-produced show which I highly recommend. The Spring-Heeled Jack episode features a contribution from the highly regarded writer and historian Mike Dash, who, as I mentioned, is an authority on this subject. There's a link in the description to Mike Dash's research and the Monster Talk episode.